that we record the session. And so just once again, Andrew Crowe, our speaker, is an AERO board member and a dedicated practitioner of resilient DIY regenerative solutions for energy and food production resources. So Andrew, take it away.
Hello, thanks for everyone being here. As previously noted, my name is Andrew Crowe. I completed my degree in cell biology and neuroscience at MSU, and I've kind of diverged from that mentality since. I've been living in a 13-foot fiberglass trailer for the last year and a half that's powered by solar panels that I installed, and have just been trying to find a better way to get more intimate with my resources, being water, energy, and food. And so this presentation is more directed towards looking at our energy, obviously, and how we can be doing things differently, maybe changing the perspective that we have on it and kind of having an alternative perspective. So I'll go ahead and share my screen and we can start the presentation. All right. So expanding our thinking, do-it-yourself alternative energy resources. So we're going to cover what alternative energy is or how it can be considered. And then we're going to be looking at heating, cooling, and battery systems that can be introduced in alternative to what we're doing now. So for heating, we're going to be looking at pairing space and water heating, using water as a battery and passive solar design. And for cooling, we're looking at evaporative cooling as an alternative to some of the technologies that we currently have. And then we'll get into batteries as well. So an important consideration to begin with is that the vast majority of the electricity that we use is utilized for space heating, air conditioning, and water heating. So if you look at the top one, that's like 70% of the electricity we use is for that particular purpose. And so essentially we can look at other ways that we can use passive resources to do that, as opposed to being reliant upon electrical technologies to be able to perform those functions. And looking at alternative energy, it can kind of be defined as broadening the understanding of what energy is and how we can collect and use energy beyond electricity. And so a way of thinking of this is, instead of looking at like photovoltaics, we can consider solar heating or passive solar gain instead. And so it's the same thing effectively, but it's looking at what can be utilized more passively that requires less infrastructure, and potentially most importantly is low tech, comparatively speaking, to a high tech system that has higher maintenance requirements and higher investment costs, generally speaking, as well. And this is important in looking at battery sustainability as well, considering that the batteries that we have now really don't have that long of life cycles. And if we're going to have a system that's resilient, it has to be something that doesn't have to be replaced consistently. And so looking at the three examples that I have down now, those are looking at 33% depth of discharge. And so that effectively means that only 1/3 of the battery is being utilized. The other 2/3 is just there to maintain the structure of the battery to prevent it from degrading prematurely. And so with lead acid batteries, 900 to 2000 life cycles and a lifespan of 2.5 to 5.5 years is really not that useful, considering all of the intensive resources that go into being able to produce these batteries. And lithium ion is a little bit better, but lithium ion also has problems looking at it in cold weather. So with cold weather, lithium ion batteries don't perform as well. And so we can look at an alternative being pneumatics or hydro, in which these systems, we have a nearly infinite number of charge and discharge cycles. And it has storage systems that will last as long as we can prevent the rust from degrading them effectively. And so they're exceptionally resilient. And so looking at one way of defining water as a battery, as opposed to utilizing electricity to run space heaters we could actually utilize water to heat our structures. And in this first example is presented with a solar hot water heater. And so with that solar hot water heater, it's heating water that goes into a water reservoir. And that water reservoir is heated so that it's pumped through the housing structure, and using radiant floor heating, it's able to disperse that heat throughout the structure as opposed to using an electrical heating method. The same water can then be utilized for hot water function as well. And so this is important considering that it's redundant. We have one system that's performing multiple functions, and it's a central mass that's being able to store that heat. And we'll get into why that's useful specifically with water in a little bit. All right. So kind of a proof of concept of that. This is our solar hot water heater that we used all summer long, and this provided all of the hot water that we utilized. And the top right picture is indicating a thermometer looking at the water coming in from the spring. And so that spring water was just passively flowing. I actually used it's just siphon. So I started a siphon with the water from the spring, and it just gradually ran. And so we had running water without any pumps. And that water that was going in was 60 degrees. Coming out of the solar hot water heater after a couple hours, 3 hours of heating, was 208 degrees approximately. And this water would last for several days. And so because it has such a large mass and water has a high specific heat, it actually retains that temperature for a very long period of time. And so it was very practical. I mean, in this picture, you can see, I mean, there was still snow in the mountains. It was early spring, and the solar hot water heater was performing its function beautifully. But we don't have to just be dependent upon solar hot water heating for this system to be functional. We can be using compost piles, we can be using wood stoves, we can be using generators, and we can also be recycling water that was previously heated and is now considered gray water effectively. And so the generator is an important consideration in that it's kind of flipping the whole idea of inefficiencies on its head, and that if we have something that is inefficient and that it's producing heat in our engineering mentality, it can actually be reused and recycled to be a functional component of the system once again. And the wood stove is very practical given our latitude, in that cold winters require a good heat source, and wood stoves are a very reliable way of doing it, and they've been used for forever, right? And so these wood stoves can act in a way where we can use the wood stove if we need additional heating, if we're not getting enough solar gain to actually heat our water, or if we just can't meet it with the other potential ways of heating our water. And so there's just kind of redundancy built into it so that you're not dependent upon one singular system to run the whole thing, as we currently are with electricity. If your electricity goes out and your heating is dependent upon electricity, then you no longer have heat. Whereas this system is redundant in every direction you could possibly think of. I think that the compost heating system is something that should certainly be highlighted. That was actually kind of developed by a guy named Jean Pain, who lived in France. He was an inventor, and he actually developed a Jean Pain compost mound system as a way of controlling forest overgrowth effectively. And so he proposed it as a way of producing jobs for people, and that they can go through forest areas, they can clean up the wood debris, they can chip it, build piles, and then you essentially have like this polyethylene pipe that runs through it. And as the carbonaceous material begins to degrade, it is an exothermic reaction. And so you're actually producing heat that normally is just lost in the atmosphere. Every compost pile you've ever seen is producing heat, and it's just waste heat. But if we actually utilize it with this method, we're able to add an additional component to heat our water for showering, for dishes, or for heating your house. And then the water as a battery, the way of kind of like conceptualizing that is that because we're able to heat water as opposed to heating air, it does a better job of actually heat retention. And a practical way of thinking about that is, you could think of like Flathead Lake in Montana, and that around Flathead Lake, we actually have the capacity to grow more temperate plants as a result of the water acting as this thermal mass and preventing significant fluctuations of temperature. And this is also seen in coastal areas. That's why areas around the coast are more moderate in temperature. And so because the water has a resistance to change, if you will, it has a high specific heat, it means that it takes more energy to heat it, but it also means that it takes longer for it to lose that heat. And so when we heat water as a mode of heating our home, we're actually able to elongate the period of time that that heat is able to be dispersed from that source. Whereas with heating just ambient air temperature in your house, as soon as you open the door, there's a significant change in indoor temperature. And it's all lost, and you're having to remake that heat in order to be able to have the heating effect again. Whereas the hot water doesn't necessarily have that effect. It's essentially using it as like an old boiler system. And then a component that is really useful in my way of thinking about it and what we kind of intend to do with the trailer is you can look at an off-grid system in which the battery bank is responsible for heating electrical appliances or to running electrical appliances to heat the space. And you'd have to expand your battery system, approximately 70% in order to be able to do that, given those previous statistics. Whereas with this system, what we could do is when our solar panels have already charged our battery at 9 or 12 o'clock in the morning, our solar panels effectively shut down and they stop producing electricity. And so that piece of infrastructure that we've invested in is essentially useless during its peak use time. And so if we can then use this solar panel and the battery bank to add the water as an additional battery by heating it, then we are utilizing electricity that we otherwise would have never had. And so it's a way of actually improving and expanding our battery capacity without investing in more batteries. And then I think probably the most obvious solution that we really should be paying attention to is just passive heating. So when we think about like how buildings are built now, I mean, you look at I've seen so many new construction sites where there's houses that have, no south-facing access to actually improve the space heating of the building. And I mean, if we just have to look at nature, I mean, biomimicry, I think, is a really beautiful way of understanding how things could be redirected. And this is a picture that I took this morning, and all the south-facing hills in this picture are barren of trees. And that's a result of the fact that in the summertime, it's so hot that it actually changes the microclimate so significantly that those trees either don't germinate or it's too dry and they can't function in those environments. And so understanding that and orienting our houses in a way that we can actually take advantage of that in the winter, and then in the summer, we can utilize very passive components like planting deciduous trees on the south sides of our houses so that we can actually shade them. And they're just like very passive things that we don't have to worry about in them not functioning. So for cooling, this is essentially looking at the difference between like swamp cooling versus air conditioning. And so a swamp cooler effectively uses the same aspect that we're looking at with water for its benefit in heating, the high specific heat, but we're using it in reverse, in that when the water is like vaporized or it's like dispersed through hot, dry air, it has the capacity to absorb a lot of heat without changing temperature. And so by doing that, you are cooling the air around it. And so that would be no different than like just walking around and like, having a wet towel on your face or something in the summertime. You can feel like an instant cooling impact. And this is really useful given that the only electrical input required for the system to run would be a fan and a water pump. And so it's a very, very simple system. It's very resilient, and it doesn't require the energy input. And once again, if you refer back to this whole idea of like how much of our electricity actually goes to heating, cooling, and water heating, by removing that, we're having a smaller investment for our battery banks. And so overall, we're less dependent upon systems that have very high failure rates, and we're not investing as much money because we have simpler systems that are longer lived. And then I think one of my favorite components that really needs to be explored further is the idea of pneumatic batteries. And so this is essentially the difference between storing kinetic versus like chemical energy. And that's how generic batteries function, is by storing energy in like a chemical form. Whereas with compressed air, you're compressing the amount of air that fits into an area. So the pressure of that air increases and it wants to reach equilibrium. And so that means that it wants to decompress back to its original pressure being 1 atm. And this is a really useful system in that there's no loss of energy density and there are infinite cycles that it can be used with. So that means that you don't lose your potency of your battery storage over time like you do with chemical batteries. And you can actually improve the density of the pneumatic battery by having it in a warmer place. So if you imagine coupling it in like a greenhouse, for example, the greenhouse heats up the space. And as you heat up the space, you also are going to be increasing the pressure of your compressed air. This is no different than looking at your tire pressure, for example. If you have tire pressures that are have a force exerted on it in which it's a colder force, then you end up having a lower PSI in your tires. This is analogous to that example. The only really issue with the pneumatic batteries is that you have this compressed air, and so you have this problem of turning your potential energy into a energy source. And to do that, what we're actually doing is we're running this compressed air through a turbine. So we're controlling the expansion of the air in something like a vane type turbine or just a generic turbine. I think a Tesla turbine is an option that needs to be looked into further. But effectively, you are expanding this air and you are creating a rotational force as a result of its expansion. But if you needed electricity now, you have to have some sort of a mechanism that would engage that turbine. But this is where we could couple something like a nickel iron battery or another longer lasting battery that's sustainable and highly recyclable. I think the nickel iron battery is a very useful battery. It's expensive right now just because there's really not that much demand for it, considering that they're heavy. But beyond that factor, they have very, very long lifespans, like 50 years or more. There's nickel iron batteries that the Edison company produced that are still functioning to this day. And they're exceptionally difficult to damage. So with most batteries, if you decharge them too significantly, you'll actually damage like the cathode and the anode of the battery, and so they no longer function, or their lifespan is significantly decreased. With these batteries, because of the ions that are actually within the battery solvent, they're so big that they can't actually damage the system, and so they actually reformulate themselves after a damaging incident like that, and there's little to no impact on their lifespan. So essentially, by using a battery bank, we can have it set up so that the turbine is optimized to run when your batteries drop below a certain level. And so that way you always have instantaneous energy, as you would expect with the systems that we currently use. Another component that needs to be addressed with pneumatic batteries is that when you take a compressed air container and you release air from it, the pressure within that pressure vessel decreases. And so you lose some of the potency simply by drawing from it. But there are a few studies that have come out recently, and this isn't really a technology that's been really researched very, very heavily in the past like 50 to 60 years, I would say, but there's now becoming more interest in it specifically for off-grid function. But if you actually take these pressure vessels and we run them in series and we have it optimized so that a small portion of compressed air is released from each one of the pressure vessels, the PSI is very consistent coming out running through the turbine, and it would be easier to refill your pressure vessels as well. And so at that point, we've kind of dealt with two of the major issues with the system. Um, and I think another really important thing to consider is that we look at inefficiencies in systems without looking at ways we can optimize what we call an inefficiency. And I think with a lot of the issues that we currently have and that we're dealing with in this world, there are problems in us calling something junk when it's not. And in this system, it's the same way. If you look at an air compressor that actually heats air or that compresses air, as the air compressor compresses it, the inefficiency is found in the heat. And so this is the same thing in the case of your automobile. Your automobile is a great heat producing component, but it doesn't really have very high efficiency beyond that. And so with this, with the compressor, if we are actually compressing air in an environment where we're potentially transferring that heat to water, and we're either using it to heat our home or we have the system set up in a greenhouse, we're passively heating a structure that needs to be heated with what we would otherwise have called an inefficiency. And so really we're getting a benefit out of it. If you look down the line, you might say that the battery is inefficient because of the fact that you don't have like 100% output of what you put into it, but you're not having to heat the greenhouse because you're using an earlier inefficiency to do that already. And so I think that the system does a very good job at being redundant in serving its function. So once we've heated the air and we need to then utilize it, we decompress it, and in decompression, we cool. And so this decompression could be set up so that it was working to help decrease the load on a refrigerator, for example. So you could have a walk-in structure that was acting as a refrigerator. And instead of just turning the temperature in that refrigerator from 80 degrees or 100 degrees down to whatever you need it to be, like 36, what you could be doing instead is using this decompression in this room. And by decompressing in that room, you're decreasing the temperature in that room before you even run your compressor to cool it. And so you're once again adding an efficiency to the system that, if not put into perspective, could be viewed as an inefficiency. And this could be amplified even further with the use of a heat pump. And you don't just have to use like an electric compressor to heat or to compress air. An alternative is actually using a hydraulic ram pump to heat or to compress the air. So a hydraulic ram pump is a technology that uses, generally speaking, high flow, low pressure water input to generate a high pressure, low flow pump. And so what you can do is pump water from a very low head water source, and you can pump it several hundred feet up a hill passively. And so this system can actually be run in reverse. And if the system is run in reverse, what you can do is the compressed air that is being formed by the water hammer effect can actually be pulled out as compressed air. And so you can produce like 65 to 100 psi, depending upon what your head is on the system. But you would be able to passively compress air with no electrical input. And it's a very, very simple system that the only moving parts and wear and tear would be to one-way valves, which are exceptionally easy to replace and recyclable. And then once again, another advantage of using the pneumatic batteries is that they can be drawn from directly without having to run it through a turbine and being converted to electricity. So we could be utilizing pneumatic powered tools, which have longer lifespans, and you're not investing in additional batteries that you would be, generally speaking, with power tools. And so you're kind of doing multiple different things with the same system. And that would make it a really easy thing to make as a central component of a house, given that it is so functional. And I think probably the most important thing out of it is that you can literally create pressure vessels out of what we would consider as being junk. Propane containers, for example, propane containers are generally rated to be like 200 psi. And so if you have a propane container that is in good condition, that isn't rusted, you can fill that with compressed air, and you can utilize that in series as part of your pneumatic battery bank. And so instead of using things like lithium that we're mining now and is like the solution to all of our problems in our perspective currently, that's how things like, for example, like Butte, look at Superfund sites that were supplying the resources that we demanded at the time that in retrospect we recognize maybe weren't really worth the inputs we were putting into them. So we can use things that are already in existence as opposed to create new demands. And a proof of concept of this is that pneumatic batteries have been used before. Like, this is how a lot of mining operations were actually able to function, is they use things called tromps, TROMPE, to generate compressed air by dropping water through a pipe using the Venturi effect. And this compressed air was utilized to bore holes into rocks, to insert dynamite, and a multitude of different functions for mining. And so pneumatics have even been looked into for locomotion. There's startups that have used compressed air to power vehicles. And so it's something that is potent. And I think that, once again, if we scale back our thinking of how much electricity we use, instead of considering the 100% demand and recognizing that 70% of that can be produced almost passively, then this 30% that is required is much more manageable with a system like pneumatics for our battery system. And so I think that more than anything, it's kind of like a perspective that we might have on these systems as to how we can further optimize them and make them more sustainable and resilient. And there's several different ways that we can look into this. I mean, there's further topics like microgrids, there's heat pumps. We can consider geothermal, central thermal mass. So I mean, in Russia and Scandinavian countries, I mean, people always had their wood stove in the center of their house, and it was surrounded by a bunch of thermal mass, meaning bricks and cob. And this material was able to sequester heat, just like water in the examples provided earlier. And this is how they were able to heat their houses without using the electrical demand that we require now. So I think that just like learning from history, and then also understanding the biomimicry and recognizing that microclimates and that we have control of those microclimates when we do construct new buildings, could significantly decrease the electrical load that we currently have, and for the better. And it would decrease the amount of resources that are required, and resources that are, generally speaking, finicky, and that they're very high tech, and you require a lot of maintenance, and that's generally high labor costs in those repairs. And so those are just kind of some ideas that I consider in my life, and how I would like to improve living in the trailer, and further when I begin homesteading and being able to heat a bigger house. So I think these ideas need to be discussed further. I think that this is the audience that is willing to take these ideas and apply them to off-grid locations in Montana to show that there are alternative ways to produce electricity, and further, there's alternative ways to utilize what we previously were dependent upon electricity for. So I would just open this up to questions at that point, and we can discuss how these technologies can be advanced.
Thank you, Andrew. That was great. There's a lot of information there, so I suspect that everyone is digesting. But let's see what shows up.
It's okay if I just ask a question?
Yeah, let's go.
Okay. So Andrew, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about scalability, because we already have an existing housing supply, and honestly, to maybe my great disappointment, people want larger homes than smaller. How do these you know, I guess I also have some concerns about, you know, round trip efficiencies and everything that you've addressed. But I do wonder how easily it might be to scale up some of these technologies to, you know, to support an average sized home as we know it in the US today.
Yeah, so some of the statistics that I was looking into, you could essentially use like a flat solar hot water heater to generate in the size of like 4 foot by 8 foot to approximately produce enough hot water for one individual in a home. And so I think that we saw that in our system with the solar hot water heater this summer, and that we had too much hot water from a very small system. And so even if we're considering baby steps in implementing these systems, having a solar hot water heater on your roof and utilizing that to aid in your hot water demand is a big step forward, and it can be integrated directly into a radiant flooring system to heat the structure as well. And so as far as retrofitting things, I think that there is plenty of opportunity to do that. And I think most definitely, most people aren't willing to change their structures of their house or have smaller houses and improve the efficiency. But I think that more than anything, it's kind of our responsibility to sequester and propagate these ideas for when people recognize that there is value in them. Because currently we have this trend because we have cheap energy. But as we saw with AERO's founding, as soon as this cheap energy became limited, or it became more expensive, things changed and people looked for other options. And so being able to present these options and put them in to demonstration so people can actually see that they work, proof of concept, then I think we're at least providing technologies that work and have function when we don't have the backup that we currently have. As far as like pneumatics for batteries really is not a great solution if you're considering being on the grid. If you're already on the grid, I think selling to the grid and almost creating microgrids from that is the most logical solution. But in off-grid applications, pneumatic battery storage is a very useful and practical way of storing electricity.
I have a question, Andrew. Yesterday in Andrew Valenus's MREA or series, I think it was yesterday, there was the video about microhydro, and he was demonstrating applications for those off and off grid. And I'm just wondering how you might tie in a microhydro system. What other of the applications and technologies you've described here would work, together with microhydro?
Yeah, so I think that the microhydro is actually almost a more useful function than the solar. I think microhydro and wind are exceptionally useful in that when they're functioning, you have to have some sort of a load on them to prevent them from essentially like self-destructing. If there's no load, they can actually spin to the point where they're damaged. And so with these systems, with a microhydro, you have a constant wattage that's coming in. And so utilizing that, you can just set your system on to a thermostat and heat your water. And so effectively, like you can use any renewable technology and apply it to these same systems. But we can take it a step further with the microhydro, and that the microhydro could also be set up to function as a pumped hydro storage system. And so if you live on an area that has enough land and ideally would have enough elevation drop to be able to get this to function, and this is being applied in larger scales across the world, but effectively if you had 2 pond structures that you had water flowing from, you could be using renewable energy during the day with solar or wind whenever you had it available to be pumping water up to your upper pond. And whenever you had an increased energy demand, you run water from the upper pond down through your turbine and you generate electricity on demand. And so with that, instead of investing in a battery system, you're actually utilizing water structures for that. And to that point, I would say we need to consider that type of an option for communities. I know I watched a presentation, geez, it must have been last year at MSU, but they were talking about different renewables and essentially like what systems are in place to combat climate change effectively. And I didn't know it prior to this, but they actually have a water turbine set up coming from the creek that supplies the water in Whitefish, Montana. And so utilizing this type of structure where we could actually have pumped hydro to accommodate for decreased water flow throughout the year, we would be able to run communities without actually having these huge complex battery banks that are too expensive to really function. I mean, to dig a pond that lasts for 300-400 years, comparatively speaking, to batteries that might last 20, seems like a way more resilient way to go about building renewable energy infrastructure for our communities.
Mhm.
Yeah, Andrew, I have a question on, you mentioned geothermal. I always think of it in larger scales where they have to really, develop a fairly substantial infrastructure. Do you have examples on smaller scales?
For smaller scale, I would say that to be most efficient, a heat pump should be coupled for the geothermal on a smaller scale. And it depends also on like soil components that you have. So like depending upon the different soil constituents you have, it changes the temperature that's actually withheld like in the soil. Because you can think of like your soil temperature as being like the average temperature that you have throughout the year. And so if you have all this heat that's being injected in the summertime, it's stored in the soil, and then you're essentially pulling it out throughout the winter. And this can be utilized in like greenhouses. So there's lots of greenhouses that utilize like geothermal technology to function. I think earth ships are another example of this technology, in which you can actually like sink houses into the soil and have a portion that's covered. And there is a significant improvement in the thermal efficiency. And so it's definitely something that can be applied at smaller scale. And there are proof of concept of that. There are working models. So using that in addition to things like passive, and then looking at solar hot water heating, et cetera, to heat, it then, once again, decreases your electrical input even further. And so it's ideally you would couple all of these different technologies for the sake of redundancy, so that if you do have a system that goes down, you're not out of luck, because you still have systems running. And as you add each system almost in series, you're increasing the efficiency of the overall thing as well.
I'm going to jump in here, and I don't mean to put anybody on the spot, and I'm going to. I apologize, but Alyssa LaChance, you just joined the call, and you haven't had a chance to listen to much of anything, so bear with me. But there really is a reasonable point to my question. So, for those who don't know Alyssa on the call, Alyssa owns Dirt Rich Compost, which is a composting and vermicast company in Columbia Falls, Montana. She converts food waste into a living, biologically active compost. And earlier in Andrew's talk today, Alyssa, he talked about using compost piles as extracting the heat from compost piles as a way to generate heat, or I guess you could convert that to electricity if you wanted to, if I understand that correctly. And I'm just curious, and I'm familiar with that technology that the gentleman's name is Payne from France. Can't think of his first name.
Jean Payne.
Jean Payne. And I'm just curious, Alyssa, from your work and your research in modern day composting facilities, is anybody, and I'm not talking about the methane from landfills, but is anybody combining a heat extraction process in modern day composting facilities that you're aware of? And do you have anything that you might like to share about what you know on that subject so far?
Hi. Yeah, I mean, from all of the people that I know, at least on the scale that I've connected with that are similar to mine, the people across the country, no one that I've talked to is doing that. It's primarily, you know, getting that compost back into the soil, and that's their primary goal. I have just mostly heard of, you know, small, just homeowners that are utilizing that tactic. I've never looked into it myself, to be honest. I've heard, you know, a new thing is just taking that waste and using it in a digester to create energy, more than actually utilizing the heat that's coming off of the compost to create energy. That's really all that I've heard of. Sorry, there's not more to contribute there.
I think that with compost too, you might have to be careful in actually pulling that heat away, because part of the exothermic reaction that's occurring with compost is advantageous to make sure that weed seeds are sterilized, and that overall the soil is is nutritious, but it's sterilized from other components within it, so there's no viable seeds. And so that might take away from it and actually elongate the composting duration that would be required to make sure that you didn't have issues with it.
Yeah, that makes sense. You'd probably also have to shift the mix to have more nitrogen than carbon, because you'd want to get it hotter, because some of the heat's going to be taken away for that purpose. Yeah, definitely.
But with that example, like Jean Payne's research indicated that he could heat a small shed to the point that it was uncomfortable to get into during the middle of a winter. And so if we think about utilizing that with greenhouses, I think there's a lot of opportunity, and they go together, obviously.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I mean, I know, I'm sorry, I joined late. Our pigs got out and I had to go wrangle them. But how long, like, are there people setting up large piles and then sticking like pipes? I've never actually looked at that design before, like sticking pipes into it and piping. How does that work?
Yeah, so effectively, I think it's polyethylene piping. So just like the black piping that you would find at a standard hardware store. And you would just run, there is a pretty, it is quite a bit of pipe that you would have to run to be able to extract the temperature from it. But you just run that pipe through it, you cover it with, generally speaking, they're just using wood chips. So it's just carbonaceous material that's digesting. And then you would have some sort of a structure around it, whether that be like straw bales or like a mesh, like a metal mesh, to make sure everything stays where it's at. And then you would put a pump on the line so you could just pull water through. And so you would inject cold water, and by the time it came out, the water can be quite hot. I mean, there's examples on YouTube of people in hot tubs outside in the middle of the winter using water solely coming from compost mounds. So it increases the temperature to 140, 150 degrees Fahrenheit, pretty easy with a small mound.
So sorry, I'm just going to be the compost nerd here and be like, okay, well, how big of a pile are you talking about with just straight wood chips? And also, how long is that lasting somebody to actually generate that much heat? That's like, you know, that's pretty hot.
Yeah, definitely. As far as the size, I know that Jean Payne has, there's the publication of his book online, and he goes through all of the specifics as to the size, the wood chip size that was most optimized in the system. I would say that it's footprint of an automobile was appropriate to do that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah, and it's, you know, it's a technology that the participant has to understand. It's a, you know, it's mobile in the sense that it's, or temporal in the sense that it's, you know, for as long as the compost pile is decomposing, you have the seed and you'll be building new ones, and, you know, it's a mobile system. But it's a great way to take advantage of heat that is occurring in the composting process, certainly with respect to wood chips. Yeah.
Very interesting. Thanks.
And I think that, I mean, I covered the electrical components of like this heating and cooling, but that's using components that use essentially like resistors to heat with. And so you're essentially just running this electricity through a smaller wire to heat an area. I mean, very similar to like a toaster oven, really, and how it functions. But But we can also consider things like heat pumps. And with heat pumps, you're significantly decreasing the electrical consumption of the system. And their efficiency is like a little bit weird to understand. I probably shouldn't even like try to present the efficiency numbers just because they're that strange to me and like comprehending. But because of the fact that it's actually almost like an exponential system, given the fact that you're using compression and expansion in the system, they can be like more than 100% efficient in how they actually function. And so you are able to use them in the wintertime, for example, in that, and a heat pump, to clarify, is effectively how a refrigerator works. So if you put your hand behind a refrigerator, you feel heat, and inside of the refrigerator, it's cold. And so a heat pump can run in both directions, and it can utilize both of those capacities within the structure. And so, for example, if it's really cold outside, what you would do is you would decompress the refrigerant, and the decompressed refrigerant would go outside, and it would be colder than it is outside. And because it's colder than it is outside, the heat from outside is actually being absorbed into the refrigerant. And then the refrigerant is brought back into the structure, and then it's compressed. And because whenever you take a compound and you compress it, you're increasing pressure, it heats it up. And because we're using things like these refrigerants that have very different temperatures with respect to compression and expansion, we're actually able to pull heat from outside using this process. And so we can reverse that and use it both directions. And it's so efficient in that the cycle can be run continuously. It just continues to run, and you're continuously pulling heat from a system, or cold in the case of air conditioning effectively. And so with that type of a system, we are effectively able to improve the efficiency of our heating and cooling significantly beyond those data points that I presented earlier in that video. And so just taking that step and looking at heat pumps and maybe looking at geothermal to expand upon that. So for example, if you have a basement or a crawl space that's not functioning, but is insulated from the outside, it's going to be warmer than it is outside at any given point in time. And so you could put a heat pump in your house, and you could be pulling heat from underneath your house and using that to heat your home. And that's something that is very practical to do. And over the long run, it's actually more affordable than the current systems we have in place with electrical heating and cooling.
I'd be curious to know how many people that are listening and that are on this this Zoom actually are living in a dwelling that's got some of the features that Andrew's talked about, and redundant features and combined features and stuff. I know that one of the buildings on my farm here was specifically designed to incorporate about 5 or 6 of these features, and it's been paying off for, over 20 years now. So, but then I live in the barn apartment, which is pretty much wood heat and electric, but wood heat's great. So, yeah, is anybody else willing to, raise their hand and say how they have used similar technologies as what Andrew's been talking about? Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, I'm actually grid connected, so mainly just solar and wind for us. Solar in town and wind and solar out here at the ranch. But as people have probably heard me say too many times, the wind and the solar is really complementary on a seasonal basis. So it's amazing to see how as the solar resource declines, the wind resource increases. And so that's been pretty cool. But I'm interested to hear about your 5 or 6 technologies, Steve, that you've got at the house on your place.
Yeah. Well, let me see if I can remember them all. Jane Kyle, who was pretty active in AERO, designed and built a house with her first husband. And she did a lot of research back in the 90s. And so it was mostly based on the passive solar approach, south windows, solarium, but it also has ground air heat source. They put an RVAC system in that would heat the hot water and dump it for heating and cooling. unfortunately, the technology on that system failed after about 10 years on the circuitry parts of it, and I had to modify it, but it's still fairly efficient. It has a centralized thermal mass heat wood stove. It was built with super insulation, two walls with a insulation sandwich in between. So the whole structure is super insulated, super efficient. I think that's all the technology that's in the house. That makes a difference. Yeah. And, you know, because it's such a tight house, it has had, you know, the problem was they couldn't, like the wood stove, it had to be vented to the outside, and air had to be coming in from outside. So I think that's it.
Yeah, and we've noticed the same problems that you noted, Mark, in that our solar is exceptionally effective in the summertime. But as we're running more and more things in the trailer, like we're running a refrigerator off of our solar panels this year that we hadn't had previously. And so we're looking into building a wind turbine to be able to supplement and then hopefully be able to use excess electricity from that to either run a boiler system or install a heat pump so that we're not so dependent, because we're dependent upon propane now for heating in the wintertime. There's really not a good solution for heating in such a small space when you don't have that much electricity. And so it's definitely been difficult finding these resources given that they're really not produced on a smaller scale. And so I think that as more data comes out, we'll see more availability, but I think largely it's kind of people just doing what we're doing and making systems work.
Andrew, you know, I know you're in a trailer, so what I'm about to suggest is not recommended, I'm sure. But I'm curious, like in a constructed tiny house, would something like a rock mass heater be available for providing heat? Would that work?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we've got friends that live in a trailer like the same size as ours, a 13-foot fiberglass trailer, and they use a wood stove. And so you can definitely do a wood stove. You just have to have the same considerations as far as making sure it's vented. It's just that you start running into problems where when you have a small space, you don't want to have a big wood stove. And as a result, your firebox is very small. And so you have limitations in how long that system can actually run just because of the limitation on the firebox. Whereas if you're using electrical input and you have redundancy in your electrical generation, being wind turbines and wind and solar, then you have the capacity to run an electric heating components. And I think that the boiler system is also something that can be utilized. I mean, boilers are effectively useful. I mean, it's just something that works. It's been utilized for a long time, and so there are options. It's just this is kind of my example is kind of a weird one.
Sure. No, but it's a, you know, I have given this not a whole lot of thought, let's just be clear. And for the movement towards tiny homes, you know, if you're wanting to be off grid or you know, self-sufficient with respect to your energy, this is an issue, because how do you manage heat in the wintertime when you're trying to minimize the size of your living space? I just got the very clear image of, yeah, would he just be
Yeah,
constant?
So I was just gonna say, Robin, I feel like, I mean, I've only built one of the rocket stoves before, and I just remember it being like a super, and it was like 8 years ago. I just remember it being a super small.
They are.
Like it wasn't like a huge, like it was mostly just, you know, organic or clay and whatever mass you have, and then just a small box that you're putting wood in. So I don't know. It seems like that would make sense, and it's holding the heat in really well.
Yeah, right. It's just a consideration of the size of the box and how often you have to feed it. You know.
Totally.
yeah. And I think that you're looking at thermal mass, and whenever you look at thermal mass,
Right.
generally speaking, whatever has high thermal mass generally has pretty high density. And so when you look at bricks or you're looking at water adds up really quickly. And if you're living in a small space, then
Right.
that becomes very difficult moving it around.
Mm.
But as far as efficiency and like small structures, I mean, definitely. I think wood stoves have to be retained, given that they add a degree of redundancy in the system that is necessary to be resilient if there is a failure on another one, especially if we're considering electrical components that like to fail.
Mhm.
Andrew, I think I've heard you talk previously about how the insulation isn't perfect on your tiny house. Have you thought about how you might address that for your living?
We've done a little bit of spray insulation in it recently. More than anything, this is kind of a temporary solution to allow us to function the way we are now. But in the future, most definitely, like having insulation is like the exact same thing as having a passive system. I mean, if you can put something in place that's just permanent that improves your efficiency passively, like that's how you decrease your demands. And so ideally, like what we're doing now with that is less than ideal. But it will be a consideration when we actually do build a structure that's permanent, for sure.
I wonder about stacking bales around your house.
Yeah, that would definitely improve our setup for sure. But I think that also just like we're pretty mobile and where we're at. And so having more things to carry around becomes more problematic because we've been parking at different landowners' properties in exchange for labor. So we haven't paid rent in like a year and a half. And we just help people out. And instead of having, you know, the middle person, which is going to be landlord, we're actually able to add value to other people's property and help them where they otherwise wouldn't be able to afford hiring people to help them. And so it's just kind of a way of building community, but it kind of puts us in kind of a situation where we're have to remain flexible for moving around.
Great.
Mark, I just want to comment on like the insulation issue. For those of you who don't know, I live with Andrew in this little trailer. And while we don't have insulation, one of the things that makes a really big difference with heating in the winter is just like passive solar, making sure that we're not parked under any trees. Like today and yesterday, it was like 20 degrees outside, but we had all of our heat sources off by 10 in the morning because it gets so hot just with the sun. And like that's really what we've been using as insulation for the past year, you know, just parking under trees in the summer and then in as much sunlight as we can in the winter. And it's been working. Super passive, but it does work pretty well for us.
Cool. Thank you, Aaron.
I have another question, you know, so bear with me, everybody, because my level of understanding is not as, you know, robust as some of you may be for. But I'm curious about wind and the what I'm going to call the standard wind turbines, and probably I'm guessing 4 or 5 years ago now. Or maybe it was longer ago, you know, on social media, I saw a technology which was rather than, you know, a turbine with blades going out perpendicular to the stand, these were a bunch of, I don't know, I guess maybe you call them micro or tiny turbines that sort of mimic the leaves on a tree, and they rotated in different directions. And the argument was that it could provide a capacity to capture smaller gusts of wind and, you know, more directions, and might have application in more confined spaces than the standard turbines. And I'm just curious if anybody is familiar with that. I have not seen it progress beyond this, what I thought was a proof of concept a number of years ago, but I haven't seen it anywhere else. And I'm curious if there are if different structures are being considered, or if there's a reason why variations to the standard turbine structure doesn't seem to be progressing through the mainstream options. Yes, Mark.
Yeah, I could talk to that a little bit. I've researched wind quite a bit. there are a couple of issues, I think. One is, as we heard, I think in the discussion with Andrew yesterday, Andrew Belinas, the amount of energy you can produce from a wind turbine is a function of its swept area. And so to get more energy out of a given wind speed, you just have to have a larger collector, which is the blades or whatever you have on a wind device. And so it often gets to be difficult to make these devices large enough to harvest a reasonable amount of energy. Now, if your demands are low, then it may work well. But if not, that gets to be a problem. And then the other thing is that the energy you get out of a wind turbine or a wind device is a function of the cube of the wind speed. So as the wind speed increases, some amount, you get 3 times that amount, say, or a cube of that amount out in energy. So it's kind of an exponential increase. And so you really want to have a strong sustained wind. And at any given site, you've got a lot of friction at the surface. And so you have a turbulent flow of wind, which comes from lots of directions and is not as strong as it would be at a higher altitude. So that's why you put the wind turbines up on towers, is because you get a strong, consistent, turbulence-free wind that produces a lot of energy. And so a lot of these things that, there's a lot of good ideas coming out there, but like the vertical axis turbines and so on, you really have an issue with those two things: getting enough of a swept area, getting them high enough, because with a vertical axis, it's tough to support the top part of the device and keep that stable. So it does seem like the existing technology, which has kind of evolved over hundreds of, if not thousands of years, is maybe a good answer.
And with the wind turbines, as you increase the blade number, you can also gather more from that. So if you have an area that has a lower average wind speed, you can add more blades to it, and that can actually harvest more of that air, but it's harder for it to get going. It does have a component going for it that it acts as like a flywheel. So as soon as it does get going, it's more likely to continue. But another thing I saw recently that they've been working on is essentially using like airfoils to have like positive interference of wind speeds. So instead of just being dependent upon like the wind speed that's available, you can use a wind foil, which is essentially like the leading edge of an airplane wing, and you can create a positive and negative pressure, and you can actually interfere those together to have like positive interference. So you increase the overall speed of the air going through it. And so that way you're actually able to harvest more wind from just your ambient air or wind speed that you have available. So just simple system that there's no moving parts, and it just functions that way. And I know there's a lot of architectural components that are also in existence where you're just using basic structures to create a function out of them.
Thank you both. That was helpful.
I have a question to kind of just put out there that's more in the realm of passive, the passive energy stuff with insulation in particular, not necessarily in small spaces, but just in, any size home. My partner and I have been looking at building straw bale. And this could be just a random question for y'all, but I feel like you might know more than I do. And we're having thoughts reconsidering that because we've heard things about there being mold issues around straw bale. I've built other types of homes with like slip and chip, wood chips with clay. I'm curious if y'all are aware of any other like really effective and efficient and safe I guess like I would prefer a natural material, but I also have friends who've gotten really sick from mold. And so that's just not something I'm willing to mess with. Yeah.
I know that hempcrete can be really, really effective. It's very durable, and if it's made properly, there's little to no risk of having mold associated with it, like you do with the straw bale.
I have heard of hempcrete, but I haven't actually looked into like pricing and R values. So, but that's a great idea. Thank you.
You probably have a lot of farmers that have a lot of excess hemp laying around that they'd give you.
Right.
To Andrew's point, I think that there is some discussion about trying to get some hempcrete plants started in Montana as a way to use up the surplus of hemp, since the fiber is not the main thing that people are raising it for right now. Another possibility is, some folks are using wool as an insulation material. So that's a natural material. Also has some pretty good properties, I think, with the lanolin and everything in it to prevent it from getting mold or mildew. And then straw bale, depending on where you are, may still be a possibility, but it has to be built with a very large overhang just to make sure that you don't get any rain or snow water on the walls. But there are a number of straw bale homes in Montana, in this area, which is probably a little bit drier than on the west side of the divide. One of which is one that AERO helped to build. AERO members helped to build.
I think cob could be a consideration as well. And instead of looking at it from like an insulation perspective, cob is actually absorbing heat throughout the day and then releasing it. And so it acts in a very similar way as the water would in the presentation, in that it just has like a high specific heat. So it retains warmth and prevents it from leaving. And so with that, you don't have as many concerns as far as like degradation as a result of like bacteria and molds. And it's very long lasting, and cob's been used in wet environments the world over, and it's been exceptionally useful.
Thanks, guys.
Alyssa, also, are you familiar with Michael Blend in Kalispell?
Yep, I am.
He built I don't know what the word is, but it's made out of sand. It's bags of sand. And so
Yep.
About how that's holding up, in Montana winters, because it's now been about 4 or 5 years that he's had that structure. And Scott Blair in Whitefish, I don't think it might be hempcrete, but he did something. If it's not hempcrete, it's something similar to hempcrete, and you might talk to him about how successful his building structure has been.
Yeah, that's interesting. I forgot. Yeah, Mark posted that it's the earth bag approach. And yeah, I know, I forgot the name too. And I hadn't actually really thought about that method, and it would definitely be worth talking to Michael. Thank you.
Steve, you're muted.
Didn't know I did that. Andrew, my question gets back to your earlier presentation where you talked about all the multiple systems, and you have a small version of multiple systems that you work off of. About 3 or 4 years ago, I heard a talk from a guy from Germany of all about communities in Germany where the whole community is bought into multiple solar and different wind and different renewable technologies. And he said that at that time, the biggest difficulty they were having was the grid that they created for their community was the electronic, the technology to keep the grid balanced, to get the energy flows, integrated and, synchronized. Is that something you have a lot of feel for or knowledge on?
I don't necessarily. I mean, it would just be based upon making sure that the grid had enough like capacitance, effectively, just it could retain an amperage or a charge to be able to service all of the community members. And I think that's where instead of like reinventing the wheel in our current system, we have a macro grid. And so really the best way that we can really integrate into that is by using the macro grid to build almost microgrids from it, if that makes sense. So like if there's multiple community members who are doing that, they're still making an impact in that there's less electricity that's having to be generated from coal or whatever the case may be because they are supplying to it. And so I think that really, I mean, there's no point in us being the experts on these things when there's already a macro grid that's functional that works really in a very similar way. So just kind of complementing all of the different sustainable components and using the infrastructure that's already available.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that's kind of, you know, they were just, I think they were more or less talking about
That
how
makes a
to
lot
make
of sense
that
to
the
me,
most
for sure.
efficient. Did I walk on somebody there?
I do know that in a lot of third world countries where actually having like a macro grid is like too expensive of an investment for the communities, they're starting out with these like microgrids. And so it might be better to look into how they're actually getting that to function and being able to just distribute electricity from their system to others. So there's already people working on it. I think it would just be seeing how they're getting that to function and how they're able to just maintain the charge.
Yeah, it's probably, I think probably would be hard to retrofit, you know, because we, to some degree, most of us in our current living situations have high inefficiencies and big loads for a bunch of reasons. And you sort of have to unravel the whole thing and start over again to maximize efficiencies. And in the rural communities in other countries that are starting with microgrids, they don't have those high efficiency and high loads to start with. So it's like they have a clean slate.
And that could be where like community members that do have access to elevation variances in their property and could have things like pumped hydro storage, they do have a battery that they could utilize to generate electricity to add to the grid. And so instead of it being like when the power goes out, you have, you know, all these power companies out like trying to fix the line that was the problem. In this case, if there were other community members who had access to larger battery sources, they could then add to the grid and effectively reduce the grid where you might have shortages. And so it would just be dependent upon what kind of batteries were available in the system. I mean, for example, in Whitefish or even Bozeman, where we have like Highlight Creek that comes down, so we have a constant supply of water, and we could be generating electricity off of that. You have a very, very consistent flow rate that you can generate from. And so I think that maybe it's not so much like reinventing how we're generating electricity or distributing it. It's just finding ways that we can optimize it so that it's just more resilient. I mean, there's these systems in place already. It's just finding a way to integrate them more sustainably, if that makes sense.
Yeah, my last comment is, you know, I'm trying to listen to this through the lens of community climate solutions, because we are, you know, that's just it wasn't necessarily something that the vast majority of us were thinking about back in the 70s, but it's added a whole different realm, you know, to the degree that we're thinking about it now, or to the degree it feels the level of pressure to find solutions. So I don't know that I have a specific question, but if anything, it's, you know, if do you or anybody else on this call have a comment to make on sort of a repursuit of these practices that have been around for a long time, and yet still feel like a lot of them are not incorporated into our mainstream. I'm just curious about, is there a comment to be made on the potential use or value in, you know, incorporating in these technologies as solutions for our communities, as we try to find a way to move forward on community-based climate solutions.
Robin, isn't that what that movie 2040 that's on the program about?
Yes, that's certainly one of the things that 2040 addresses. You're right. And thank you for the plug, because that film is tonight, Wednesday, December 2nd from 7 to 8:30. And if you go to the website, I guess I could put that link here. Anyways, you can watch it for free. So I'll go ahead and put that in the website.
Yeah, I think really just like optimizing efficiencies of the electronics that we use, recognizing how we could be using alternative energy sources as opposed to electronics. And then the biggest thing really is just rethinking our batteries, because fossil fuels are their own battery. And so if we're going to replace that and use a more renewable component, we have to find a way to actually retain that energy and take from it on demand. And so I think that's where you start looking into like larger pneumatic systems. They're trying to like use oil drilling rigs to dig huge cisterns that would effectively be used to store compressed air. There's a lot of hydrogen components that are being discussed right now, and really like pumped hydro storage. I mean, looking at Kalispell, for example, with the Hungry Horse Reservoir, I mean, that's a huge component of the electricity in that area. And it's obviously maladaptive in some components, but it's actually worked out to be relatively adaptive in others. So just kind of finding the balance and recognizing what we're willing to sacrifice to be able to continue having the grid that we have now, assuming that we don't have cheap energy that acts as its own battery. So it's just kind of going to be a personal decision, and I think it's going to become more and more a community by community basis.
I guess I'm kind of on the, I guess it's almost becoming conventional side, given the huge housing stock we already have, to go with the electrify everything and green the grid kind of approach. But I do think moving forward for new construction, we have to really have some much higher standards for housing than we have now. You know, the passive house kind of homes standard, I think is something that, you know, speaking of scaling up, could be scaled up pretty quickly and be made a requirement for new homes. But it's just so hard politically to get those things done. In Montana specifically, I think moving forward even on increasing requirements for energy efficiency and, you know, new code requirements, I think is going to be difficult with the political landscape that we're seeing now.
Make a comment about the new construction. The builders in Montana are resistant pretty much to any type of a change. I recall it was about 10 years ago, Chris Borton, he was with Oasis. He would travel around doing classes on alternative energy. And there were, I know in Helena, there was 120 people attending, and he would ask the group, how many people are interested in installing wind? And over half would raise their hand, and he would say, by the time I'm through talking, the majority of you will no longer raise your hand. He talked about the maintenance, the fact that if you couldn't maintain it every year, lowering it down, that the maintenance fee would take up all the wind energy. One of the things that we built a couple of years ago, we built a garage with an apartment above it, and it has solar. It was a do-it-yourself solar. I put on a 4 kW system, got it out of, well, there's two companies, Solaris and Unbound Solar. It's a 4 kW, and it's a steel building. It's a staggered stud 2x8 with Roxel bat, so it's an R30 wall, about an R70 in the ceiling. Roxel bats. So Roxel is a slag material. It made Canada, and R40 in the floor, and that 4 kW system produces about a little over $600 a year. It's a net, that takes care of it has a heat pump, and there's no gas and no wood stove, and it's pretty much net energy. It's just what, it's not passive house. It's very tightly constructed, but with just that amounts of insulation, it's been working fine. We also have with the state, we have a loan program. I know it's up to $40,000 at 3.25% for any type of alternative energy. And once a person's established a loan, most of it's going now for photovoltaic. I don't think they've done in the last year any wind. It's all pretty much photovoltaic, a few ground source heat pumps. You could put in a wood stove if you wanted to get a loan for alternative energy. And then once the main purpose is the alternative energy system, you can add things on. If you're building a home, saying I'm going to have a solar system, but I want to increase the insulation levels, that can be rolled into the loan. 3.25% for up to 10 years or 4, I think maybe it's 10 years. I don't, but yeah, it's up to 40,000 for 10 years at 3.25%.
Okay, good to know.
Do you know if that there's like a phasing out of that opportunity loan wise, or if that's just like happening for an undetermined amount of time?
The loan has been going on for about 5 years. It's the DEQ issues fines against air polluters. So a lot of the money is coming from the refinery in Billings. If they violate the air quality rules, the DEQ fines them, and the legislature set it up that money should go for renewable energy in Montana. So it depends on the amount of fines going in, but there's funding available. It's still there to my knowledge, and should be as long as they keep violating air quality rules, they'll keep getting fined. There was, and I can pass it on to you, Robin. There was a study done last year on now zero energy homes are cost effective just by doing the adequate amount of insulation, building tight, having an all electric with a heat pump. It is not, this article comes up, it's cost effective. And they pick different cities. And I think Bozeman is one of the cities that they do analysis on. And I'll send that to you. So,
Okay, do that. That'd be great. Thank you. Well, I realized I just looked at the time. We have 1 minute to 2:30, so we're just about done. I think I'm going to close this out. Is there anything else anybody wants to say as we complete? Mark does. Here we go.
Yeah, just real quick, Robin, could you remind us what the expectation is on availability of the recordings that are being made?
That's an excellent question. The recordings are they're available almost instantaneously. It's just a question of getting them to our YouTube channel. So probably by next week, if not, probably within a week of the session would be safe.
Okay, great. Coulter, who was on earlier, wasn't able to stay for the whole thing and asked about that, and so I'll let him know.
Okay. And we'll send out an announcement once they're all up. But I just want to give us a little bit of lead time there.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Anything else anybody wants to share as we say goodbye? I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation and this time together, and appreciate Andrew, your efforts and your discussion and your thoughts and opinions. And I'm glad we had this time. Does anybody else have anything to say as we go out?
Thanks for a great presentation, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for listening and caring about these resources.